Okay, I think we can all get back to our seats. I see a few trickling in from the hallway, but we'll get started with our third of four panels, this one entitled From Asylum to Bedlam, Migration, Refugees, and the Future of the European Union. Our moderator will be my colleague, Justyna Zajac, who is the director of the Polish Studies Center here at the Hamilton Luger School, as well as Jean Monnet Chair of European Security Studies. Justyna is a professor of practice here at HLS in the Department of International Studies, as well as a faculty member in the Department of Political Science. So, Justyna, please.
Thank you so much, Dean Cerchari, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to our panel, From Asylum to Bedlam, Migration, Refugees, and the Future of the European Union. As you know, the migration to the European Union is not a new phenomenon. However, over the last decade, Europe has faced really a rising challenge of irregular migration. And there were two significant crises in the last decades. 2015, when the Syrian refugees fleeing civil war overwhelmed several European countries, and 2022 with the refugees from Ukraine after Russia invaded Ukraine. However, every day, actually, there is the number of refugees and asylum seekers coming from Africa, Middle East, Asia, posing challenges to the European integration, cohesion, and democracy. So our panel is going to revolve around three main questions, among others, but the questions are: how do the European Union and its member states respond to irregular migration, and how do they manage border crisis? What challenges does irregular migration pose to European societies? And also, what impact does irregular migration have on politics and democracy in Europe? So this question will be explored by our distinguished panelists, who I would like to welcome very warmly, starting with Muna Adem. And Muna is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Maryland. Her research lies at the intersection of race, ethnicity, and immigration. So more specifically, Muna is interested in examining how immigration-driven society or diversity influence relations, group divisions, and ethno-racial inequalities, both in Europe and the United States. Then Nick Bichet, and Nick is assistant professor, Department of Political Science here at Indiana University. And Nick's area of research is democracy, democratic backsliding, populism, radical parties, political economy. And primary research focus, geographically speaking, is this radical right and populist parties in Europe. And then is Nikos Zachariadis, and Nikos is Marty Bookman Chair and Distinguished Professor of International Studies, Rhodes College. So Nikos' research aimed to better understanding of the dynamics of making and implementing European competition, security, and trade policies. So thank you so much for accepting the invitation for our panel. And we will start with the preliminary talk from each of you. But before also I give you the floor, I would like just to make sure that we are all on the same page whenever we are talking about the term. So let me briefly explain basic terms that we will be using during our panel: migrant, refugee, and asylum seeker. So whenever we will be talking about migrant, immigrant is a person who crosses national borders within the intent to stay in the host country. So we talk about the regular migrants and irregular migrants. Regular, those are people who goes through legal channels, they complete the necessary paperwork. Irregular, these are the people who don't. Refugee is a person who is recognized by the host country as someone who has been forced to flee their own country due to persecution, war, or violence. So refugees, we know, are granted rights under international law. And asylum seeker, someone who seeks asylum and applies for legal status as a refugee in the host country. Having said that, without further ado, Nikos, we will start with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Justina. And I want to thank everyone here for coming, and especially the administrators at the Luger School for the kind invitation. I know it takes a village, and I know a lot of you have worked very hard, and it doesn't look like it, but we appreciate it. I appreciate it. When I was asked to speak to you, I had great thoughts and aspirations about I'll put together a lecture and you'll hear everything you ever wanted to know about irregular migration in Europe, but we're afraid to ask. Well, you're not going to get that. So let me then talk a little bit about the European Union, essentially actions of the EU and what has it done. And then throughout the Q&A, we'll talk a little bit about the points that I can elaborate on any of the points that I will raise. So I will simply raise some points. The first one that I want to raise is that the issue of irregular migrants, and I'm only talking about irregular migrants because that's the biggest issue right now in Europe. The issue of irregular migrants is not big at all in terms of size. It is big in terms of politics. So in terms of size, to give you an idea, Europe in 2020, that's the latest figure that I was able, sort of a comparable figure across the board, I was able to find from IOM. It is about, Europe had about 750 million people, about 43 million were born outside of Europe. It represents about 5.6, 5.8% of the population born outside of Europe. That's legal, illegal migrants, everybody all together. Annually, in that year, 2020, irregular migrants represented 0.03% of that population. Minuscule. If you think about it, it's not really anything worth talking about, at least in terms of numbers. Now that's 2020, that's coronavirus year, so it was a little different. Double it, that's how much it normally is on average. So in terms of size, it's not a big deal. So what is a big deal? The big deal is the politics behind it. And the politics is as follows. It used to be, first of all, it's not a new issue. It's an old issue. It has been with Europe at least since the 1990s. It has gained attention a little more recently, perhaps in 2015 because of the spike from Syrians coming in. But nevertheless, the numbers, if you look at the numbers over time, they haven't changed dramatically. They're about 150 to 200,000, that's the estimate, in terms of irregular migrants coming in. That means that the types of people that are coming in, it's mostly depending on which route you're talking about. There are 4 routes actually in Europe. You have the eastern one, essentially from Turkey flooding the Greek islands. The central one from Tunisia and Libya, crossing the Mediterranean into mostly Malta, not mostly, only Malta and Italy. And you have the western one, the Spanish enclave north of Morocco, through Morocco, hoping to cross to Spain. And you have the Atlantic, the Canary Islands, again, through Spain. The political issue is that it used to be humanitarian, economic in nature. Now it no longer is framed that way. That is, the frame has changed into a security cultural frame, which makes it far more zero-sum and us versus them type of issue. Makes it far more difficult to deal with. In terms of what has been done, you have a shift since 2015, where you had a spike of approximately 1 million irregular migrants. You no longer have that. From reception and camps to social integration policies. You no longer have as many people coming in, so now people have to think about, well, how do we integrate these people? It raises significant social issues within societies that they haven't been able to deal with. It raises issues of coordination. It raises issues of processing. Who gets to process them? We'll talk about that in a moment. The frames have changed, as I said, and on an EU level now, the situation has changed. Not dramatically, but it has changed. You have the most recent pact on asylum and migration that was actually signed in 2024. It has done a couple of things. The first one, it has streamlined the asylum application process, which is very, very important because now they can shop across countries. It has not changed the Dublin regulation any. It hasn't revisited the issue, and that's an issue that we can discuss. It talks a lot about third countries, which means that now a lot of the processing, many countries hope to actually now conduct not in Europe, but in third countries. You've heard about the situation with the Italians signing with Albania, the camps, the closed camps that they have over there now. That's a very specific situation. We can talk about what that means. And we also have these pushbacks that are not necessarily legal, but are happening on the ground. And so they're trying to deal with migration in those ways. Now, what are the implications, just very briefly, for European integration and European security? Number one, they are bringing European integration forward and they're pushing it backward. That is, they have conflicting implications. Jean Monnet famously said that Europe will be forged in crises. Well, it definitely is. The immigration or migration policy was not ever an EU policy. It was always a national policy. Now it has become, and it is becoming, an EU policy. Slowly but surely. And what seems to be happening is several countries are pushing and pulling it in different directions. So you have famously Hungary, which does not want any migrants, is not interested in discussing any of that with Brussels. In fact, Orban said, we'll dump them in Brussels if they come here. You have other countries that are much more willing to accept migrants. You have the Mediterranean countries who are bearing the brunt of all of this migration coming forward, that are screaming there is no solidarity. You have Germany, for its own reasons, closing its borders for domestic political reasons, and that's creating a chain reaction, which undermines Schengen and the free flow of people across national borders. You have Poland that are now calling to shut down temporarily their borders because of the weaponization of migration by Belarus and Russia. So you've got all sorts of issues that I think will make for a very interesting discussion, should there be any questions about that. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. Yes, thank you all for being here. I've enjoyed this conference so much, and as someone who really value interdisciplinary research, I love learning from other disciplines, and which I have done so far. So the kind of broader question I'm going to answer is how does irregular migration in Europe create challenges? And I think there's three big challenges. The first one, as my panelists kind of described, is integration. Integration in terms of both economic integration, but also symbolic and cultural integration. And to kind of really give you the human face behind this and the importance of it, sociologists often look at second generation and third generation to see how successful or the failure of second generation immigrants in Europe. And I can use myself as an example. So my family fled Ethiopia in the 80s, which kind of faced one of the worst humanitarian crises. And we first landed in Germany. And I was born in a refugee campus in Germany, but Germany at that time had very strict citizenship laws, and my family felt like we needed to migrate to Sweden because they heard that Sweden was a bit better in terms of law for integrating immigrants. So we ended up coming to Sweden, and that's where my family has been for the past 30 years or so. One of the things, and of course, Sweden has long been held as a role model for not only immigration policies, but gender and equality and so on. But one of the things about Sweden, especially when you think about national identity, Sweden has for a long time have always welcomed immigrants and said, we love them, we want them here, as long as they don't come to my backyard. And this is why we actually see very severe segregation levels in Sweden. So at first, when my family got there, we lived in rural neighborhoods in Sweden, but the racism and the xenophobia was so severe, like kids were throwing bombs in our balconies, and we went to the police, and they were like, oh, if one of you don't die, we can't do much. So it didn't take much for my family to essentially move in the middle of the night, and we ended up getting to, the government placed us, it's what's called now immigrant ghettos. So what is immigrant ghettos? These are essentially neighborhood with 99% immigrants, very poor, which are really struggling right now. For migrants though, for second generation, this actually is a safe haven. Why? Because at least people look like you, live here, they understand your struggle, and they understand that even though you try to integrate, there was a lot of backlash from native-born Swedes who was more likely to say, yes, we appreciate you, but you gotta stick to your own kind of place, right? So now you also have, but the irony of that is it creates sense of belonging, but now you're excluded socioeconomically, right? So, and this has created a huge issue for politicians and for government in Sweden, and how do you now integrate immigrants and native-born Swedes when you have this severe segregation? And another issue, so now my nephews and nieces, which are third generation, the gangs and the violence in these immigrant neighborhoods have really, really increased. And you would think that, wow, in a country like Sweden, they have gang issues, and they really do. And especially when it comes to guns. So now you see a high rate of young men, especially immigrant men, dying because of gun violence. And me, myself, and my siblings, who are first generation, We are worried about the second generation and the gangs recruiting them in this neighborhood. And it's really difficult to actually leave this neighborhood if you know anything about mobility in Sweden and how it operates, and I'm happy to talk about that more generally. But all this to say, this kind of level of segregation that you have in Sweden in some ways are helpful for immigrants to feel that they are around people who look like them, but of course it's creating really a national level issues of how to best integrate them once you have established this level of segregation, even in countries like Sweden, where you would assume there's a lot more equality and so on. And I think the second challenges, which is related to the first, is really how do we promote social cohesion? And we do see a lot of research in sociology and I think in political science, both in the US and in Europe, are seeing the decline of social cohesion. And this is largely due to decline in trust. So when you don't trust your fellow citizens to actually respect the laws and to believe that everyone is kind of contribute to the public good, then you are less likely to contribute to the public good. And what is considered public good? Well, we can take welfare spending in Europe. So increasingly, for example, in Sweden, native-born Swedes are less likely to support welfare spending because they believe that immigrants are coming here and exploiting the resources, which, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A, it's not actually true. A lot of immigrants do actually want to contribute more. They want to have a job. They want to be able to do their part. But one of the biggest issues, especially for new immigrants, is language barriers. And there's no way to improve it unless you actually give them the tools to learn the languages, right? But more generally, we know social cohesion is going down, and when that goes down, this is also linked to decline in trust, decline in cooperation, decline in solidarity, and so on. And the third, I think, the challenge, which is also linked to the first and the second, is the increase of group threat. Group threat in both in political science and sociology is probably one of the most robust theories to understand how anti-immigrant sentiments have increased. Again, think about US, how immigration has been used in the US to say, well, they're coming here, they're gonna use your jobs, they're gonna take the resources, and this is why we need to close the border, and so on. So a lot more people are thinking, well, if this is gonna hurt me on a personal level, and they're gonna threaten, the threat that they create is fear that I'm gonna lose out, then you're less likely to show empathy, you're less likely to kind of accept immigrants, and more likely to show prejudice, anti-immigrant sentiments, and racism more generally. And of course, group threat has been used, or just threat that immigrant pose, has really been used by political parties and the far right, which I know my colleague here will talk about in Europe. And using Sweden again, the Swedish Democrat, for example, it's one of the most severely and most anti-immigrant political party for the longest in Sweden. And it was a huge surprise that they even got voted in, because at one point, they actually was saying that they want to divide schools by ethnic lines, so bloodlines. So all the white Swedes will be in one school and everyone else in another school. And that Swedes were even willing to accept a party like this, it's really, really astonishing. And again, what did they do? They used the level of neighborhood segregation and crimes and violence to get the support, instead of asking, but why are crimes higher in these neighborhoods? Why are immigrant youths rioting? Why are immigrant youths behaving this way, right? And they don't want to ask that question because that will force them to think about larger social inequalities that we are seeing not only in Sweden, but of course in Europe more generally and the US. And I'm happy to talk about all these three challenges in the Q&A. Thank you.
Hello, okay, great. Thanks, and thank you everybody for being here. So that's great, because that's kind of exactly where I wanted to pick up. Anyway, talking about the effect that this immigration has had on policy, excuse me, on politics and democracy in Europe, largely via this increase in these radical right parties that you were mentioning. So the first part then is how immigration actually leads to an increase in support for these parties, which I'll be a little briefer on because I think you did a great job already. But then the second, which is equally important, I think, is how this is actually altering politics and endangering democracy in Europe. So first, how does immigration contribute to this populism, radical right, or anti-immigrant parties? We can use them pretty interchangeably for now. But generally, we think of the rise of these parties as two forces, like any economist would about anything, supply and demand. So supply, meaning the institutions like electoral systems that make it easier for these parties to win, but more importantly for today is demand, which asks what actually causes people to want to support and vote for these parties. And as you may guess by the title of this panel, the number one predictor of an individual's support for an anti-immigrant party is their view on immigration. So for example, surveys of supporters of these parties find that like 2% of them say they want to see immigrants in their country. Compared more nationally to Europe, that number is like 6 or 7 times as high. And then second, the vast majority of voters for these parties say that it's specifically because of their views on immigration that they choose to support them. So a lot of these supporters are what many call losers, not in the traditional like schoolyard bully word for loser, but as in we've seen dramatic gains in wealth in terms of globalization and modernization, but very often these people who support these parties have left out. So we see evidence that places that were hurt more by trade or jobs going overseas are much more likely to support these parties. So we can kind of see then how these populist radical parties might really make strides here, right? These people have felt long like they don't fit in, and now you have some party talking to you saying, hey, it's not your fault, it's the immigrants' fault, right? Everyone's looking for a scapegoat, and they've provided them, which is why we see the success of these parties rise so much when immigration becomes more important, or when immigration increases, because these arguments become much more successful. And so we could kind of see these arguments taking two forms, one being actually economic, which might make sense, but the other, as you were saying, being threats to cultural identity, which evidence suggests is much more the driver of these result. Arguments like diluting our culture or hurting our national identity is really what seems to be driving this result, not actually the economic arguments. So these parties kind of take hold of these fears, which, as Nico said in the beginning, are not new. In fact, evidence doesn't really show much change in support for immigration over time, but it has become much more important in determining how someone will vote or not. And when they see immigration rise, these arguments become much more persuasive to them, so we see support for these parties increase. So part number 2 then, why do these parties have anything to do with democracy if they're anti-immigrant? They tend to speak very differently from more mainstream politicians. When you see politicians speak, they disagree with their opponents, but I know there's some irony talking about this like 3 days before our election, but they disagree with their opponents, but that's it, right? When they lose, they cede power and let the other party take power. But with these parties, we don't see that. So we have a lot of different definitions about populism, but the one thing that most everyone agrees on is that they believe their opponents are illegitimate, and that if they win power, they're still not legitimate rulers, they shouldn't be in control, and their supporters shouldn't be represented in politics, right? Only the populist leader and his people are the legitimate, or her people are the legitimate rulers, and only they should be able to have a say in politics, which of course is averse to everything we know about democracy, right? So if a populist has bad coverage in the media, that means the media is corrupt. If there's a court ruling that goes against them, it's because courts aren't democratic. If they lose an election, it's because the election is rigged, right? But for your supporters, that's great, because you're doing what no one else has been able to do and solving all these things that you now think are super huge problems. So we've seen, the obvious cases like Hungary and Poland of what happens here, but there's evidence of this happening throughout Europe when these parties are successful. Press freedom declining, journalists being much more likely to be thrown in jail, civil liberties, things like freedom of speech and expression, religion, equality under the law for all decline when these parties, these anti-immigrant parties, do come to power. Just some quick examples. In Finland, the True Finns came to power and dramatically cut academic freedom and led to a big increase in self-censorship among academics. In Norway, the Progress Party created a new immigration and integration ministry and toughened the restrictions on immigration and made it much harder to seek asylum in the country. So in the end, in sum, what happens is this increasing immigration really increases the salience or the importance of immigration in voters' decision-making process, which leads them to these new parties which are promising to be outsiders that have new solutions to answer these parties, and then in the end we see a dramatic threat to democracy. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And you all mentioned in your preliminary talk about the really challenges for the European integration process. So let me ask each of you one question, like a round of questions that you see from your own perspective. So Nikos, you talk about it's not a large number really of irregular migrants, but currently it's a problem. The narrative is about the security, so they threat us coming to Europe. So if you could dwell more about the security, how it's really the challenge for the security in Europe. And then Muna, if I could ask you about the other countries in Europe, because you mentioned Sweden. It's a very interesting case, what you said. Do you see Sweden more like exception or rather like example of the broader pattern that is happening in the other countries? And with Nick, when you talk about these anti-immigrants parties, what I'm thinking is, you know, these parties are raising the number of the people who vote for them, for anti-immigrant far-right parties. But actually, they are rarely in power, because even if they win the election, the parliamentary election, they are not able to form the governments because they don't have the coalition capabilities. So except of maybe Poland for 8 years, that's changed last year, except of Hungary, they are not really in the government. So how would you explain that those parties that jeopardize the democracy and democratic system? And actually, why don't we start from the reverse order? So Nick, starting with you.
Okay. Yeah, so that's a great point. Like you said, outside of Hungary and Poland, and more recently Italy, we haven't seen, you know, dramatic success in terms of a far-right prime minister, right? And yet I argued that they harm democracy. So I think that they can affect democracy in two different ways. So when you see these radical right prime ministers, that's when you can see such deterioration that we don't consider Hungary to be democracy. And like you said, for 8 years didn't consider Poland to be democratic either. We're probably, hopefully, not going to see such dramatic backsliding with the increase of the radical right. But we have seen them form coalitions in about half of European countries and enter in as junior coalition members. We're not going to see, like I said, completely eroding constraints and leading to, you know, a non-democratic country anymore. But when you become a junior coalition member, like they have in half of European countries, you do control ministries. You don't just get to speak anymore, but actually act and implement policy. In fact, all of the examples I gave in places like Finland and Norway, those were actually junior coalition members, right? Or in Austria, the Alliance for the Future of Austria became a coalition member in 2005, and they were given control over the Ministry of Justice, and while there, they dramatically changed asylum law. They made it much easier to deport asylum seekers. Many would argue against international law. They made it legal to force feed them. They eased the process of prosecuting lawyers and NGOs who work just to help asylum seekers. We've seen very similar things in Italy and Norway. But again, all while they weren't in power, but just given control of some ministries. And those same results about freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of expression have all been shown. Academic freedom, press freedom, to decline, even if they're not in power themselves, but just supporting a government and given control of a few ministries.
So I think Sweden is definitely an example of what's happening in Europe more broadly. They might be unique in terms of the level of segregation that we see, since it does have one of the highest segregation in Europe. But I do think it reflects broader patterns. And I know, so for example, sociologist Jean Beeman have done research on second generation of Black immigrants in France. And here you can think about, and she's kind of putting the differences between being legally integrated, where you have actually citizenship, where you were born in the country, but yet at the same time, you don't have cultural citizenship, where you are recognized as a fellow citizen. And other work has been done on Turkish immigrants in Germany, where again, Turkish in Germany has been there for a long time, but they still feel that they are not treated as a fellow citizen in terms of symbolic belonging. So this is kind of also showing, I think, the importance of thinking beyond citizenship as being some sort of legal rights or kind of legal inclusion, and to think about what happens when once migrants, newly arrived migrants, for example, get legal rights, what happens then when we try to incorporate them in other areas, symbolically, culturally, and so on. So Sweden might be unique in the terms of segregation level, but I definitely don't think it's unique in terms of what we're seeing of lack of integration and the revival of ethnic identity that we see among second and third generation of immigrants in Europe more broadly. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that is a very good question. Let me give it some answers. First of all, I want to emphasize the fact that migration policy has a moral hazard built into its design, and that's built into it. You can't get rid of it. And the moral hazard is as follows. If you make it welcoming, then they'll keep coming. If you make it unwelcoming, then they'll stay away, but then you become something that you profess you're not. And that's where Europeans tend to be. That's what they're trying to address. I haven't been able to do so. Now, in terms of security, it depends on what you mean, what one means by security. How do you define security? If you define it primarily in conventional terms, no, the biggest security threat in Europe, in fact, it's Europe's existential threat is not migration. It's actually what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. How do you deal with Russia? That's the key issue in the long run and in the short run. However, migration is an issue. They've got to deal with it somehow. On a human level, when you're talking about sort of individuals and individual level security, yes, then it becomes a problem. If you look at it from a political perspective, no, not really. If you look at it as a common crime, then yes, it becomes an issue. Many criminal events in Germany, for example, that led to the closing of the borders were caused by migrants. You hear the term migrant, he came from such and such, and therefore that's a problem. We need to deal with it. Forgetting, of course, that the problem is not necessarily the more recent migrants. Most of the terrorists, if you'd like to think of it that way, are actually homegrown in Europe, and have actually been born in Europe. They didn't migrate to Europe. They're not first generation migrants. But nevertheless, that's small, sub-notes in the grander narrative that unfortunately tends to look at the headlines, and the headlines do say that these are people who create issues, and therefore we need to protect ourselves somehow, and the idea is deport them, but they have no idea where to return them. That's one of the biggest problems that they're facing right now. Italy is going through it. supposedly the successful model that many other countries are looking for. They have no idea what they're going to do with it. It will fail. I will guarantee you it will fail. We can talk about why shortly.
You said, I think, make more clear why Japan is looking on Europe and said we don't want to follow this pattern because it does not work, as it was said in the previous panel. So before I open the floor for the questions from the audience, just let me ask the final question more about the problem solving. And what kind of solution do you see from your own expertise and the angles that you focus your research on? So Muna, about the best ways to integrate newcomers in terms of symbolic inclusion, but also socioeconomic integration. Then Nick, if I can ask you and dwell a little bit in the question, where the rising position of anti-immigrants parties come from, whether it comes and it's driven, by the people, by the voters' opinion, or more by the political elites. So where is the source? And then Nikos, if I could ask you more about, the solution coming from the national and supranational level. You mentioned now this immigration policy goes more on the supranational level and the EU, not the national. What solution do you see from this perspective? So Muna, why don't we start with you?
Yes, the solution for that. I think this is actually a really incredibly difficult question because I think it starts first and foremost by desegregating neighborhoods. Why? Because segregation in terms of neighborhoods create more than that. It creates segregation in your mind. You don't have contact with people who look different from you. And in sociology, contact theory is the one theory that has found most robust evidence to lower prejudice, lower anti-immigrant sentiment, and so on. But how do we get people to create relations between each other? And you don't have to think about immigration in Europe to just think of examples. Think of US. We know racial segregation in US is very problematic. But if you take the most liberal white American, even if they believe in equality and justice and they want to reduce neighborhood segregation, they probably will never be willing to move to, let's say, South Chicago to improve it, right? Why? Well, there's not much individual incentive to do that, even if we know at the society level it would actually improve a lot of issues. So it's the same kind of dilemma in Europe. A lot of native borns may not be willing to move to immigrant neighborhoods, and a lot of immigrants now feel like, well, I prefer to live in a neighborhood where people look more like me to avoid discrimination and so on. But I do think it's going to come down to policies where it has to come from the up to the below. I'm not sure yet how that's going to happen, so I'm going to think about that. But I do think, for example, the government can do more to place immigrants where you have a more balance between migrants and native born, especially for new arrival, so they can see the both sides. So they do get integrated, they do feel they're part of the society, while at the same time getting ties to their ethnic community as well. You also have to create those kind of balanced communities. How we do that? Yes, I will. Maybe someone else in the audience have ideas. So I don't have that yet.
Yeah, one of the coolest studies I've seen recently found like a 50% drop in Islamophobic hate speech in Liverpool when they signed Mohamed Salah onto the team. So there could be something there. Okay, so where does support for these parties come from? That's a good question that a lot of people have asked, because it seems like we've seen a dramatic shift in the last decade or 2 decades in opinions on immigration and how pro-immigrant people are. In fact, a lot of people call it like a wave, right? The wave of anti-immigrant sentiment or the wave of populism coming. But research suggests that's not true, and if anything, in Europe, we've actually seen an increase. That is, the European people becoming more pro-immigration, largely due to younger people becoming voting age. So we haven't actually seen any real change in opinion towards immigration or how welcoming they think their country should be towards immigrants. But it has become more important. That is, when people decide how they're going to vote, if maybe immigration was like 5th on their list of being important in making a decision, for many people that's risen to now being the most important decision, again, at least if you're voting for some of these parties. So it's become much more important, even though actual opinion hasn't really changed about that, which is to say, where does this come from? It's the title of a really famous book that looked into this, and the title is called Democracy Erodes from the Top, because it's not being driven by the people. Their opinions really haven't changed on a lot of this, but a lot of politicians have found if I go and say horrible things about immigrants and blame them for all these problems and use rhetoric that we would have thought would be disqualifying 30 years ago for a politician to say, a lot of people will like that and will vote for me, and then I can be elected. So it's not really a wave at all, but rather a reservoir that's always existed, that politicians are now tapping into and finding that they can they can use this as fuel to win elections, which is a long way of saying I don't know what the solution to that problem is, other than changing minds, like you said, finding ways to integrate through contact, higher levels of education as well, obviously dramatically decrease someone's likelihood of voting for these parties. But yeah, it is very much an elite-driven process that we've been seeing and not from the people.
Thank you. I think that's a great question. Let me preface my answer with the following aphorism. I'm the perfect academic. I am excellent with diagnoses. I am very, very poor with solutions. But let me take a stab at this. I urge everybody to think about the migration problem in sort of along 2 axes in terms of solutions. The first, at least in Europe, is the supranational national. Where will the solutions come from? Part of the majority of them will come from national leaders. The reason is because these policies are driven by domestic issues that individual countries are facing. We're talking about Europe. There is no Europe other than in a general sense. There is Germany, there is France, and what is happening over there is what affects Germany and France, not necessarily what affects Europe in general, which means it's a mosaic of issues. What's going to happen at the EU level is the EU needs to coordinate all of these activities, provide or redistribute, if you'd like, the funds. We do need a new Jacques Delors. If you'd like, at the EU level, we do need greater European national leadership. All the wrong leaders seem to be gaining traction, the Melonis, the Orbans of the world, in quotation marks. If you like them, good for you. But there doesn't seem to be any sort of solution-driven national leaders from the other side to argue the point that, what is it that we're doing? Now, the other axis is the push and pull factors that the literature talks about. Why are these people leaving? Why are they coming here? If you want to limit the flow, you've got to, unfortunately, make it an uninviting process. Third countries have served well in that regard. It doesn't make them proud Europeans, but unfortunately, they're doing that. The situation with Turkey, for example, the situation, the Italians, their bilateral agreements with Libya and Tunisia are essentially forcing them to police their borders so that you have fewer people coming in. The problem with that, of course, there's always a problem, and that is it creates leverage for these countries to then open or close the spigot whenever they want more from you. And the Europeans have been happy to pay the check. We'll see how it happens. Long-term solutions, If you're really looking for the long-term solution, that is, you've got to start thinking about, well, why are they leaving in the first place? And how can you address this issue? Europe has not been interested in that. They have done very little about it. I don't think there is an interest in doing anything about. So what is the solution to that insofar as Europe is concerned today? Nothing. They'll just keep coming, and all they can do is just try to shield the borders, build bigger fences, hoping they don't come through.
Thank you so much. Let me open the floor for the questions from our audience. So please, if you have a question, raise your hand. And there is the microphone somewhere there. Yes.
Hi, my name is Georgia Pollard. I'm a student here at HLS. Growing up, I lived in Finland, where I attended an immigration classroom that I attended school with kids from Sri Lanka, Colombia, Afghanistan, Iran, where the Finnish government has seemed to put refugee children into lower levels of education to attempt to integrate refugee and asylum seekers into Finnish society. Growing up, I followed up with a lot of my classmates, and it seemed that a lot of them had successfully attended Finnish universities and then gone on to get Finnish or jobs in Finland, seeming that the integration model had been successful. I'm wondering if that model of integration can be seen throughout the EU, and maybe if that could be a model as well for different European countries.
So thank you for that question. And I think actually of all Scandinavian countries, so Finland and Norway, I think are really interesting. Finland in particular, because they actually have one of the most restricted immigration policies. Like they actually don't accept the level of immigrants that Sweden do. But I do think that how you integrate them in the classroom is essential. And I'm curious to know how they got immigrants to get interested in the university and get a higher degree of that. And I'm assuming one of the reasons for that is that you are also surrounded by other youth or older folks, I guess, that are equally interested in. And you can talk about it and you get inspired. And this is in contrast to, for example, the neighborhood I grew up in. Most people finish high school or gymnasium after that. The young women will often have children in a very early age, or males. Most of the guys that I knew grew up, either unfortunately was in prison, in and out of prison, or did drugs. So, and it's part because that's kind of all we knew, and we didn't know that you can get a university degree. We didn't have anyone on our network that could inspire us to get it. So I do think it's essential, but Finland, I think, is a unique case because they're pretty restrict of who they accept and the level of acceptance that they have.
I can add slightly to that in that some Northern European countries have the luxury of accepting people. Looking at it from Southern Europe, the Mediterranean, the countries of entry, where you don't have the luxury of accepting, part of the issue that they're facing is that they're being overrun by migrants, I should say, who don't want to stay there. And therefore, the level of integration that is desired is just not there. They're just stuck. I mean, that's the only reason why they're there. How do you now integrate these people who have to now realize that I've got to do something now, this is it, there's no more future. What they have done is, and this is new to most of these societies, I can tell you about Greece, they haven't really tried these kinds of policies until the last 20, 25 years. That's it. It was a very homogeneous society. What they have done is they've tried to put them in classrooms that are in normal public schools, and they have so many seats for migrants. The problem, of course, as you probably can guess, is language. their language skills are nowhere to be found, and therefore they've sort of isolated them, which of course creates a problem, because if integration is the point, isolation is exactly what you shouldn't be doing, but by pragmatic way, you cannot do anything about. That also creates social tension, and the best way to deal with social tension is not to deal with it at all, which is exactly what Greek politicians are doing. They're just zip it and just shove them over there. If you don't talk about it, problem solved. And that creates all sorts of local now issues that will burst in the national scene every so often because of particular policy windows for those of you who are interested in public policy making.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly, I guess, that the contact idea, it does matter, the mechanism, right, by which you do it. So that seems like a great model. Obviously, I half jokingly, but signing a rock star soccer player it can be a great model too. But then, yeah, in places like Greece, you do sometimes see the opposite. So some researchers looked at 2 islands that were identical, except for one was like 2 kilometers closer to Turkey, which meant all the refugee ships were going there instead of this other island. And they found that anti-immigrant sentiment was much higher on this island that, again, was otherwise identical, but just a little bit closer, which meant that's where the refugee camp was. And then within the island, people who lived closer to the camp were also much more likely to have anti-immigrant opinions. So if you're not, doing things right, this contact can actually backfire in a way.
Hi, Ryan McDonald again from Hamilton Luger. I wanted to ask Nicholas in particular, we have seen a lot of even centrist and left-wing parties acquiesce to right-wing framings of immigration issues. We've seen the increasing adaptation by the Democrats in the United States, and particularly to this kind of hostile towards immigration stance. What role, if any, do these parties acquiescence to the sort of right-wing framing and being just more broadly anti-migrant categorically contribute to this development and escalation of far-right and even, migrant expulsory-oriented parties?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the background there is that there's a lot of evidence that shows when a radical right or anti-immigrant party becomes successful, all the other parties in the country start shifting towards that view as well, because they don't want to lose out, right, on the success that this party is having. A famous example of this in the Netherlands, the Prime Minister Mark Rutte eventually said to immigrants, act normal or leave, right, which was never the way he had spoken before, but the party there, the radical right party, had become so successful that it forced him to kind of move to the right. So it has a huge effect in 2 ways, I think. One is that it just legitimizes what is often racist rhetoric and action, right? It no longer seems taboo. The people saying these things no longer seem like they're out of step with the rest of politics. Now it's become the way politicians speak. They call that like pulling their platform into the mainstream, right? Now it's the way everybody thinks. But second, which is actually very counterintuitive, is that the effect of all these center and even sometimes left-wing parties moving rightward on immigration is that it doesn't work. If anything, it just leads the far right to be even more successful than they were beforehand, because now it convinces everyone, oh, these are really important issues, right? Look, everyone's talking about them. This is clearly something that matters. But these guys were first to it, and obviously they have the best solutions, so I'm just going to support them. So it completely backfires in most cases and just leads the far right to be even more successful. So it's kind of like a fulfilling loop there. So legitimizes, but then also just they end up doing better anyways. Yeah.
Thanks so much for your really interesting comments today. I have one question about the short-term versus long-term problem. So in the long term, it seems clear that given falling birth rates, et cetera, it is very much in the interest of many states in the EU, but globally as well, to be welcoming of all kinds of immigrants in order to serve their own economic prosperity. And so, one question is, what needs to happen for the political parties of today to shift toward that more long-term view that would help them find the motivation and incentives to improve the situation. And I worry that actually all political parties right now have a very short-term view, which is simply getting reelected and nothing beyond that, so maybe that's the answer. But this actually shifts me to a different challenge, I think. We've talked about how immigrants can be weaponized in the ways you've discussed, but thinking about immigrants as a future, talent pool, if you will, operationalizes or instrumentalizes them in a different way. And we've seen some, I think, unfortunate circumstances where in the wake of big humanitarian crises, countries are in effect looking at the people who are in refugee camps and trying to sort them into which ones will be valuable to us and which ones will not, and finding pathways to preferential admission and so forth, even for refugees and asylees, which I find problematic. So how do we revitalize the human rights framework and the international law framework and recenter the migrants themselves rather than thinking about this only through the lens of the needs of individual states? Thanks.
Do you want me to? Sure. I can start and then my colleagues will jump in. You ask way too many questions. Good ones too, that's the problem. How do you deal with this issue in the long run? I talk to my students about it, about the need to address the demographic changes in our countries, generally around the globe. The only way that I can see this changing is by shifting the frame. It's the psychology behind the public policy. As long as the frame is cultural and or security, it becomes an us versus them. So it's very easy to fall into that trap. There is no way out of it. That is, immigrants have no place in our society. If you change it into an economic frame, then you can start to see how the benefits of it. And I believe there are many, many very good benefits, and I'll be brutally honest, I am one of those benefits. I'm a first generation migrant. I actually migrated legally, for those of you who are wondering. So the second part of this question is very, very difficult to respond, and I think the whole aspect of the debate, the discourse, has been completely warped. And insofar as migration issues are concerned, it seems that they've all been collapsed into irregular migration. So every time we talk about migration, we only talk about irregular migration. We put the rest of them in there. These types of situations that you have described about discriminating along whatever dimensions between refugees in various camps, they've been going on forever. Well, I don't know about forever, but certainly for a while. The EU has engaged in that process legally. They are engaging in that process today. And I don't see any way around it, because politically they see themselves as there are people from certain countries that it's easier politically to accept, such as Syria. I calculated once, 2018 data. It's about 80% of the Syrians who applied for asylum got it. About 45% of Iraqis, 30% of Afghani, 20%. Of Africans and sub-Saharan Africans. It was shocking to me, but it happened. I'm sure it's very similar today. Can it change? I'm not so sure.
I would just very quickly say my answer would be exactly what you said, which is if the effect of a policy is long-term, then that party's probably not going to get credit for it. So they would be more incentivized to focus on short-term things that will help them win re-election, and that's why it's, I think, really hard to solve this problem.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I've always found it weird that we have to reframe immigrants and see how we can reframe it in a way that is going to improve people's attitude. And why do I have issues with that? Because at the heart of it, I think, and someone was talking about this earlier, at the heart of it is really all of us want the same thing. We want a good life, we want to have access to opportunities, to resources, and so on. But I think I've developed a kind of pessimistic view of human beings lately. And I think what it is that most people, unfortunately, would never change, will never show empathy or solidarity unless there is an individual incentive behind it. So I think most people will be willing, for example, to accept immigrants and accept refugees and so on, if they can benefit from that. So I think reframing it in that way is probably the only solution to it. How we reframe it, I think it's weird also to be like, well, we need immigrants because we need to increase our fertility rate. We need more. It's weird to even say it, but I think that would be one of the ways. And to be like, oh, well, if you don't want your country to essentially disappear, you need more immigrants. Will that work? I'm not sure, because I think a lot of people will be, oh, well, we want immigrants, but we also don't want our national identity, let's say, as white American to decline, so then we want more people who look like us to breed the same people like us, and so on. I don't think there's a lot of people who think like that. There's probably enough minorities who think like that that's gonna have some sort of backlash to reframe immigrants in terms of demographic change and so on. But yeah.
Hi, I'm an undergraduate from HLS, and my question is, how do Russia and Belarus utilize immigration as a tool to exert pressure on the European Union, and what strategies or policies do they employ to weaponize migration flows? And to what extent do these tactics actually impact EU's internal stability and border security? And is EU currently utilizing any policies to effectively respond to these tactics without compromising its humanitarian commitments?
I think it's mostly to Nikos, to you. It's how Russia and Belarus utilize, like weaponize migrants that goes through the Poland, Belarusian, and Poland, and the Lithuanian border, and how it affects also the integration, and whether the European Union does anything about that.
I see. Okay. All right. Thank you. It's a good question. The weaponization is by policing their borders. Essentially, what you try to do is you put pressure on the resources of the recipient country by flooding it with all of these migrants trying to cross the border. And then you put the country on the defensive. It happened in between Greece and Turkey in 2020. It is happening right now, or did happen with Poland. The idea being the more you flood them, the less likely they are to welcome these. They're now irregular migrants. We're only talking about that. The more you flood them with people, the less likely they are to accept them. The more likely they are to close the borders. Therefore, the further away they move from the ideal sort of European policy that everybody professes. We are a welcoming place. We protect human rights, etc. Because they're pushing them back. You're not coming in. Remember one thing about Europe that's a little different. Once they reach European soil, by law there are protections. There are laws that protect them in the process that they use. Which is very different than if they were processed, let's say, in Belarus. where out of sight, out of mind, I don't know what you're doing, do what it is you need to do. What that makes the EU, now what are the effects on the EU? Poland specifically, they asked for the option to close the borders temporarily. It reduces Schengen, the free flow of people. It undermines European integration insofar as it includes that, and reintroduces national borders, which makes it far more difficult to move forward insofar as integration is concerned. It's taking it back, that is, several decades. Plus it puts pressure on the resources now that the country has to expend in order to deal with now these huge numbers, or however big they are, numbers of migrants that they did not expect. Got to plan for all of these things in advance. If you're caught with your pants down, so to speak, that's a problem. And many European countries have been actually caught that way.
Being from Poland and following this process, and I would say this what Russia is doing, and with the help of Belarusian regime, unfortunately is very effective in the sense that the goal of this is to undermine the cohesion of the societies, and I think it polarized the societies even more. So I see it in the example of the Polish society very clearly, that there are people who support the entrance of those people on the border, and there are the people who are absolutely against, and this is like this dispute within society. So this is the nature of the hybrid threat that Russia actually is doing, and it's quite effective, unfortunately. So currently the Polish government, and this is the center government, center liberal, is considering, I'm not sure whether they already implemented it, but to suspend the asylum procedure. So even the asylum requests are not going to be considered by the Polish authorities. So actually all major parties, they are on the same page, like we are not allowed those people to come in. So, the less cohesive EU member states are in the EU, the better for Russia and also the allies. Yes, I see the question there. Mm-hmm.
Hi, I just had a question. I worked 3 years in Petit Chateau in Brussels, Klein Castelgie with refugees from 2020 to 2023. And majority of asylum seekers who were coming were from war-torn countries. So the question is that if BAMF has a problem in Germany, if Frontex is failed to do the responsibility of border control, if Fedazil has problem in Brussels, so don't you think changing in foreign policy of European Union towards Middle East countries can be a solution in this regard to prevent irregularity of immigration in European Union? Thank you.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. Getting more involved in the Middle East would affect the migration flows insofar as the eastern and central route are concerned. Remember, well, you don't remember, you don't know. Each route attracts different nationalities. So most of the Middle Easterners are coming from the eastern route, central Greece, or the central route, Malta and Italy. The other ones to the west are mostly sub-Saharan Africans. Yeah, it would. I believe it would. Do you know any European leaders who want to get involved in the Middle East, who have shown at least any interest in getting involved? Zero. it's a very difficult situation. I mean, I will agree with you. They think that it's incredibly complex. They don't want to get involved because they're going to get burned. Chances are they will. And they're happy to let the Americans take the blame, whatever blame there is, or the Israelis, or whatever it is. So I think they're playing exactly what our government used to teach us during the 1950s, duck and cover. And don't worry about it, and whenever it happens, it happens.
Okay, so we have time for one more question, and then here, and unfortunately, will be the last one.
Hello there. My name is Shrikar Vasan, and I'm an undergraduate here at HLS. I have a quick question because about, I don't even know how many years ago, but we saw that Britain left the European Union with Brexit. And one of the deep concerns among people who voted for Brexit was that Britain wasn't able to execute border controls. It wasn't able to control the flow of migrants. It was being bogged down by the European Union. There are further concerns about migration. For example, Professor, you mentioned Greece, right? And along with all the things with the euro and the eurozone back in the day, we see that there's become a focus on the problem of migration. We've seen that this has brought problems with the cohesion of the European Union. In such a context, do you think that there could be severe problems that lead to breakaways of states in the future? Thank you.
Okay. I think it creates issues. It has created fissures that run north-south, the old ones, sort of the rich and the poor, if you want, something like that, and east-west, new-old Europe. I think these are widening, and what migration has shown are two contradictory elements of European integration. One is greater push for integration because they realize that the migration issue will not be solved nationally. It will only be addressed supranationally with national, obviously, solutions. There's no question about it, but it's got to be coordinated at the EU level. The other thing that they have also realized is that there is very little solidarity, at least insofar as the publics are concerned. You have essentially many of the former Visegrad countries, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary. I don't want to mention Poland, but yeah, it's part of it. Who are less interested insofar as migration is concerned. They've actually been very vocal about the relocation situation that was a big deal a few years ago. They were not interested in having any migrants there. I remember seeing, 10 people that were allowed to relocate. That's tiny. And that has created problems, especially for first entrance countries that are bearing the brunt of this issue, that are complaining that we're not getting the support. The pact was supposed to address this issue. It will not. It has not. Only revisiting the Dublin regulation will, and that will not happen. What's the Dublin regulation? Threw out debate, but nobody caught it. I don't know why. Here is the Dublin regulation essentially says that if you're caught as an irregular migrant anywhere in Europe, you're sent back to the country of entry to be processed. And the idea was so that you don't shop around for the easiest way in. Well, now with the streamlining of the process, hopefully that will not be happening anymore, and you will revisit the issue. Why will they not revisit the issue? Because it means essentially a Northern European problem has become a Southern European problem, because that's where they're coming from. The Southerners are saying, please, please, let's revisit it. The Northerners are saying, no, 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 this is working perfectly. So it will end up happening, and yeah, it will make the European Union less cohesive. Whether it will lead to more breakaways, I don't think so. I think the British are actually eating their words now. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, I think I can add to that. I do think, for example, Brexit, if I remember correctly, a lot of young people were actually against it. And this shows you the benefit. And now, for example, I think they regret it in part. They don't have that kind of flow that they can go to, like, oh, I want to go to Sweden and just test working there, right? So, but I do think European Union have hurt, because especially when it comes to immigration flow, some countries feel like they're taking on too many, while other countries are refusing to take on. So that is creating, I think, more people to be resistant and feeling that it's an unfair relationship right now, where some countries are doing more, others are doing less. But I think more generally, though, especially among young folks, they do feel that they enjoy the benefit of the European Union, and because of that, I don't think we will see a breakdown, at least for now.
Yeah, I very briefly, I agree, but it is interesting to note that these same parties that I've been talking about, who are very anti-immigrant, are also very anti-EU often, and very Eurosceptic. There's a big overlap there, and it's for the exact same reason, right? They say they're anti-immigrant because they're losing their cultural identity, and then expand those exact same arguments to saying, and also the EU is taking away our sovereignty and getting rid of our independence, and we can't do what we want, right? So we do see a big overlap there, but yeah, ultimately I don't think I see any other countries breaking away. Like everyone said, it's all the coverage has shown how it's been quite bad for the UK and not really beneficial in the ways they argued.
Thank you. Let's thank another great panel for all of their illumination insights. I really appreciate the way you talked about issues at the level of the European Union, within the domestic politics of various countries, and even down to the level of neighborhoods where migrants are coexisting with the pre-existing populations. And so thank you for that. Outside in the atrium, we have a lunch, buffet style, ready to be served. Get something to eat, and afterwards, please be sure to linger around, and up and down the hallway just outside of this auditorium, we have a number of graduate students from here at Indiana University who are going to be postering and presenting snapshots of projects that they're working on that are related to our symposium theme. So you can just sort of visit them at your leisure in the time between lunch and the commencement of our final panel at 2 p.m. on linguistic and cultural preservation. So thanks, everybody. Have a nice bite to eat, and please stop by the postering session.